I'm Rick from Cartridge Classic Cars. On this video, we're back on the 70 Challenger. By the time we're done with this video, we should have this whole rear end structure on the car, including the trunk and everything else with the tail panel and even down to the valance. We're gonna try to bolt it on. So we got the tail panel, we got the two trunk gutters we're gonna install, we got the deck filler panel right here, and we got our quarter panels. Now, we're gonna go ahead first and strip these parts down to complete bare metal. With this car, we'll kind of go above and beyond on the protection. You could leave the E-coat on it. On the outside of the skins, I don't recommend it, but on the inside, a lot of times, we have just scuffed it up and then put epoxy over it. But like I said, on this car, I'm gonna show you a couple different processes on how we'll go about sandblasting them with a pot blaster, a dry blaster. We're gonna use a blast cabinet for the smaller stuff, and then we'll go ahead and strip it down with some other hand tools that you'll see in the video. So a lot of these parts have already been test fitted one time on the car. You saw in the last video, some of those parts have been on there, and we did our inner structure, our wheel houses, and everything else here with the trunk brackets that was installed last video. Before we welded all that up, like I said, we did test fit this stuff. What I also ended up doing, I made a lot of marks on the quarter panels and everything else where I got to drill holes. But with these quarter panels, they're AMD, and what I like to do, I like to set my doors down a little bit lower on the side of the car, and what that does, we like to close the door gaps. The factory E-body cars, a lot of these cars had really big door gaps. So, like I said, I like to pull the doors down, and what that does, it leaves too much of the quarter panel sticking out when you try to line it up. So what I like to do is I like to pull the whole quarter panel down. So we'll end up cutting the bottom of the quarter panel a lot of times, and while it's on the car, I suck the quarter panel back in, and then we overlap it, cut it one time, and we tack it up. I'll come through before we strip it down, and we'll TIG weld this whole part, you'll see, grind it down, and then we'll prep the back of the outside. So same thing with this one I'm showing you right here. We cut this one on the bottom. It was sticking out too far. I also made a couple marks. We're gonna just bring this edge right here inside a little bit. You can see with the door, when we line the door up right there with the rocker panel and on our fenders, you can see the door just is in a little bit far versus this piece. Now, I just think that's gonna be easier to fix this and get the car perfect panel to panel lined up than go ahead and having a larger hood gap and everything. Again, we're trying to build these cars in this shop better than factory. So normally the factory would just leave the door sticking out, and if the front gap's a little bit wider, they don't care. But like I said, I think we can dial it in by just cutting a little line, pushing this in, welding it, and you're not gonna see this once we clean it up on both sides. And then when we put the quarter panel in, it's gonna wanna suck in a little bit more. So I made marks on that. We'll go ahead and do that. And then same thing, when we pull that in, we're same thing with this one. We had to suck the back of this quarter panel in. So we'll go ahead and weld that. You can see I also made marks, this is what I was talking about earlier, where we're gonna put holes, rosette holes for our MIG welder, where you see we're gonna use a spot welder also on this. But getting the spot welder down here at this angle, we can do it a little bit, but realistically, using the MIG welder, I know I can get a really good solid weld. So we'll MIG weld it, and we'll come back through and hit it with the spot welder if we can. Finally, when all that's done, we have our roof sitting here. I have all those areas marked out. Same thing. We're gonna strip the roof. We're gonna, on the inside, we're gonna prime every one of these parts on the inside. On the first step of this whole process, we'll go ahead and assemble those parts, and then we'll finish it off, cap it off with the roof. I'll show you how we go about doing that. And then really, at the end of this video, if all goes to plan, this 70 Challenger should look like a complete car, and the whole entire body should be completely finished. At least for the rough metal work. And then we'll come back on the next video. I'll tell you what we're going to do on this car. So this isn't the last video on the car, but this car should really start taking shape. So stay tuned. Let's get to working, and we'll get to it. The first step in the whole build process and what we're going to do to start getting these panels prepped to be installed for the final time on the car is we're going to go back through now, like I said, and weld up those panels, the quarter panels that we ended up cutting to move down and suck in a little bit. I am using the TIG welder. The reason I'm using the TIG welder is because I believe it gives you a better weld that you could flanish out. It's a softer weld than a MIG welder. We also don't have the imperfections that you would get from spotting a MIG welder. You can miss a spot or impurities, something like that. The TIG welder is just one solid run. We can hammer and dolly real quickly these when it's done, and you'll almost never know. Looking right here, you can see you need a really good penetrated weld, so that is on both sides. You have your stacks on top, and then looking through the back, you could see the weld comes all the way through. If you're not getting that penetration, your weld has a better chance of breaking, especially if you're grinding the front side of it. That's going to weaken the weld if it's not going all the way through. So just showing, if you could see the back side of the panel, what to look for. When you do this enough and you're confident in seeing your back panel a lot, when you can't see your back panel in the future, on future panels and everything else, then you're not as worried about it, because you're on the same settings on the TIG welder and you're just confident in your ability. So like I said, once you're done with the weld, we're going to go ahead and we're going to grind it. I'm using a belt sander, and we're confident in grinding this flush for the most part, because our weld extends all the way through, has the penetration. Saying that, I still don't go digging into the weld. We're talking about 18 gauge sheet metal here, so that's something that we just don't want to dig into the weld or make it weaker. So I might leave a little bit of weld exposed and let the body work cover that up, and we're talking ever so slightly. You'll see on the walk around later. So what I'm doing now that we're done welding both of the quarter panels, we're going to go ahead and anywhere the spot welder can't reach, you can see I made some X's, and we'll get it with the hole punches and just run right through it. Now, saying that, the quarter panels, technically I can get the spot welder up and down the whole quarter panel. I adjust them and I cut them a lot of times to move the quarter panels, and I use straps. You'll see it in the future. So for me, it's easier to put MIG welds on that initially, get the quarter panel adjusted, then just come back through and spot weld on top of it for like that factory look and extra level of just holding it on there. I didn't explain that on the intro, but that's also another reason why we go ahead and MIG weld. It just gives us more flexibility. And then, like I said, what's great about the MIG welds, once you do a good MIG weld and you grind it down, everything, you really can't see it. So if you don't like the spot weld look on the door jambs and you're building a real slick hot rod or something, this is something we'd probably leave out of the build process, so we don't have those little spot weld dimples in there to give you that slick look. Again, it depends on what the owner's trying to accomplish on the car. For this car, for the most part, being what it is, a 440 4-speed Hemi orange, it had some Mr. Norm's history in it and everything. We're trying to tribute and build the car back to how it would have came for the most part off the assembly line. Like I said, we're not going crazy. We do add more spot welders. There's certain things that if you're a real purist and you want to see an unrestored car, you're probably going to find issues with this car, because it's obviously going to be restored and not 100% factory. Back to what's going on the build with the quarter panels. You see we got our Eastwood SCT. We're taking the drum sander and we're just going over the whole inside of the quarter panel and knocking off the E-coat for the most part. Now, saying that, I do have a lot of people that like to leave the E-coat on the inside. I have others that we scuff it up to the best of our ability with the 80 grit and epoxy it. And we have some cars like this one that the way to do it, and the ultimate way I feel of sealing everything down, is going to be remove the E-coat completely, and then we're going to put epoxy primer over that. The reason is the E-coat, I have found in the past, not everywhere, obviously this quarter panel looked pretty clean for the most part, but I have found rust spots underneath it. You could see where just when it was before it was E-coated, it must have been sitting around, properly handled, so there is some rust behind it. Saying that, your epoxy or whatever you're spraying is only as strong as your base layer. So if we go ahead and we put epoxy on something, if the E-coat underneath delaminates, well, the epoxy might be able to hold it a little bit, but there's a greater chance that the epoxy is also going to come off too because there's nothing underneath holding it. So at this point, we know if we strip everything down to bare metal, we follow the TDS sheet for the epoxy. Once we go ahead and epoxy, that we know that that epoxy should be doing its job, protecting the bare metal and gripping to the bare metal. Obviously, this does add a little bit of time to the build in general, but if you really think about on building these cars and as special as they are and how much time we take to fitting them and buying all these new metals, especially the really bad one, they're, brand new cars when they're done. I mean, really, I think this is just a small added insurance policy to just make sure your car is going to last and you not have any issues, especially on your high-end paint jobs, with the Mopars, because we're also painting the insides of a lot of these cars. So it's the same process on the roof. The roof actually is a little bit easier. I built a little dolly table to hold the roof while we're stripping it down. It's got some foam pads on it because what you really don't want to do, and it's especially amplified on the roof because it's a weaker panel, hoods that are a similar way, is I'm pushing down ever so slightly and I'm constantly moving. We don't want to build the heat up. We don't want to warp the hood. We don't want to damage the hood. This is a really weak piece without the structure on the car. Well, even with the roof, with the structure holding the roof, sometimes you drop something on the roof, it's going to ding right away. So like I said, I'm just using SET again. I'm just running down, not making sure I'm not putting heat on it. Every now and then I'll check it and all that, and I'm going to come back like I did with the quarter panels, and we're going to get all the edges and gaps. And with a sanding disc, surface prep disc, we'll go ahead and use the belt sander in certain areas with a 120 grit, and just a bunch of other stuff that I have, tools, tricks. Just be creative. It doesn't matter what you do. The idea for stripping these parts down is really you want to remove the e-coat without really scuffing down the metal or taking off metal. When you see sparks fly, right there you're removing metal. I'm not saying I don't use 80 grit. It happens, but we try to limit how much metal we take off because, again, that's going to make it a little bit weaker. So the other option for stripping parts is right here, sandblasting. So you can see right now we're doing the tail panel and a tail panel to get all the belt sander, surface prep disc in there and everything. It just really isn't worth the time and effort. And then if you get a belt sander in there, you're not going to strip all that down. You're going to just get as much bits and pieces as you can. You'll come in with a red Scotch-Brite, scuff it up, and there's nothing wrong with that. But again, taking this car down to the bare metal, we can set up this quick little pop blaster, and it's efficient enough that I could sit there and just run the blasting sand, the glass, it's medium grit blasting glass. I could run that at a lower pressure where this e-coat, it just comes off. We're not digging into Bondo. We're not worried about warping these panels or anything. And same thing with the rear valance. I could just hit it under all the brackets, everything. And this process just speeds up pretty quick. And we're just out a bag of sand. With the sandblasting, it's all great. Just remember about the safety. Fresh air is the way to go. Make sure you're using an actual sandblast sand, whether it's cold slag, medium grit, or glass, whatever it is. Don't be using pool sand. It's not made for it. Airborne particles go in. You can see I'm protecting my body with a full suit and the blast back, and I also am wearing gloves. This is going to, one, help my hands from getting hit by the sand, and two, it's going to stop the oils from getting into the open porous metal now that we blasted and open it up. You'll know sandblast sand, it really will absorb rust and start flash rusting really fast. So one way to stop that is don't touch the metal. Now that all the parts are stripped, that we're going to be installing, whether it be in the blast or anything else. We have the trunk gutter still that we'll probably throw in the blast cabinet, but we're going to go through and we're going to DA sand with 120 grit, following the TDS sheet prior to the epoxy primer. So everything that we've just done, we'll take the DA sander, we'll just run over really quick. This is going to ensure that there's no gouges in it. It kind of smooths everything out, and it gets us to touch it one more time and just do a quick overlook. And it also, of course, helps adhere for the epoxy
primer. It's also going to make sure you don't have a deep gouge, and just evens everything out. So this is obviously a real fast just touch over. We're not trying to do anything crazy. You can actually see the tooth from the DA sander actually when you're going over it, so you know exactly where you are. I also use a backing pad, which is a little half-inch foam pad pressure thing, so the sandpaper actually on the DA will start flexing around different corners and not put pressure on certain areas, gouging it more. The whole idea, like I said, with this whole process is just trying to even everything out and make it, where it's consistent, following the TDS to get that mechanical adhesion tooth that the epoxy needs to grip onto. It's, adhering it, and that's how the epoxy is going to settle around the gouges, the small little grooves in the panel to stay adhered. So now I got everything hung up and prepped, ready for the epoxy. The first thing I usually always do to save myself a bunch of time and effort is we'll go through and we'll put our weld through primer everywhere we're going to weld. If you think about it, if I went and just epoxied everything we just stripped down, I'd have to come back through with the belt sander and redo the first step. So you see, everything I'm doing in this process and why I'm trying to show it is I found a way to be, or I'm trying every day to also modify this way to be more and more efficient on building these cars. We don't want to sacrifice quality, but we want to just not be doing things 4 or 5 times. I see people all the time, will sandblast a car when everything's done, and assembled, and, they'd sandblast a car and then find half the car's rotted away again. That's why I sandblast the car initially. That's why all these processes happen. That's exactly why we're putting weld through primer here first. We stripped everything down, we put weld through primer, and then we tape up our edges where the weld through primer needs to go. I mean, what that just does now, yeah, it took a little bit longer to tape, but taping is a whole lot easier than going back through and then resanding everything again. So, and to me, again, it just overall makes more sense. So in building these cars, this is, I think, the most efficient way to do it, where you don't get as unmotivated trying to do the same thing. Like, okay, we stripped the panels, now we, epoxied it, and now we got to strip the panels again. Like, that takes forever. So again, that's what we're trying to do here. Work by the hour. I'm trying to get the owners of these cars the best value for their dollar without, of course, costing into my time. So it's beneficial for both of us for me to be efficient in what we do. So that's how our process is geared to. Right now, back to the build again, we're using the Omni MP 170. We're going to put 2 coats on here. It's a gray epoxy. Everything, like I said, is prepped down. I am running my first coat a little bit heavier, and same thing, I just put 2 heavy coats on it. Just let the first one flash off, which means, it's not shiny, and you see I got good ventilation where the air is being sucked out of here, so the overspray and everything's not a problem. But we'll just go through. Also, a good thing about putting a second coat is you covered everything. You could definitely miss something, and I have missed something on second coat too, so you just go back and do it. So now that all that is in epoxy, it's drying, I'm not going to touch it, and I really don't want to be grinding on it for at least 3 days, but we could start handling it and assembling the parts a day later. That's for the epoxy primer. The weld through primer, 15 minutes, you can do all that. So like I said, we're going to wait 24 hours. We're going to move on to the trunk gutters, and you can see right now they're in the blast cabin. Anything small that I could fit in the blast cabin again is a little bit less of a waste, because we're keeping all the crushed glass inside circulating. It's a gravity feed suction blaster, and you see it just does a good job for these little parts where it would be inefficient to sit there and just take it out back and blow it across the yard, because it's such a small piece. You got to kind of hold it while you're blasting. It's, again, what makes sense and what doesn't. So we're finally into it. The assembly of the rear sheet metal on the 70 Challenger. It took a lot to prep us to get here. But again, it's going to be well worth it for this car and the quality of this car when it's done. Yeah, it's cool to say, yeah, I built that whole Challenger in a week and I flew through it and I don't care. But I mean, for us at this shop, it's not about the speed I'm building these cars. It's about giving the owner exactly what they want and the quality they want. And we're after searching for the highest quality. Like, I'm always trying to convince the owner to do, because it's my name on the bill too. So I try to convince them, hey, I understand what you're doing, but for usually this, and this, we can just add it. And now we're stepping up the game. So saying that, we're going to go ahead. We put the deck filler on. You can see I'm putting the quarter panels on now. Again, they've been on the car before, so I kind of have an idea where they're going to go, so this makes it a little bit easier. You can see I'm ratcheting the front, and I'm focusing on that front door gap and door body line. That's crucial on this car. Saying that, you could see when I move the front how the back is twisting around. I'm saying that because lately I've had a bunch of people contact me in the last few weeks about cars, Challengers, Cudas, other cars, models, and all that, where the body line is sagging in the back. Now, that's something that you probably installed the quarter panel wrong, your frame rails are too low, or your body line shooting down, and it all comes down to, you see this crucial part right here. You want to test fit all your parts first before you weld anything, and it really comes down to your wheelhouses. That's why in the last video we did all the external sheet metal test fitting, and then we come back through once we're looking at the body lines and making sure everything on the sheet metal is where we want it. Then we could come back and weld it. That's another reason why I'm telling you, I think the jig is crucial here. If you're building these cars on the ground, that's stuff you don't know about. You can't see if the body line moved. You can also see, what I like to do is take a straight edge, and I like to straight edge the door to the quarter panel. Obviously, some of these cars are not straight. This one in particular, when you go up top, the body lines do curve out and in a little bit. But saying that, what I like to do, I like to make sure there's not any crazy dips in or dips out. So we're trying to get as close as we can to the door gap, so when you look down the side with no filler, the car already looks better than factory and straight. And then we can just take it to whatever the owner's level they want, panel to panel, or just like a factory look. So same thing right here. We're about the body line. I'm pulling, prying, adjusting a little bit to just get that panel to panel a little bit closer. So, we don't look down and see the door sticking out on top or in the middle and the two edges are lined up. And then it also really helps when you do this with a straight edge on the blocking phase. You could take a block, the body work, everything is going to just save us time down the road to get this car where we want. These are the crucial steps in the metal work and putting on the quarter panels. If you mess up a quarter panel, like I said, if the body line's off, if all this is not right, something's major not wrong, if you don't pull off that quarter panel, you go straight to body work, you're going to have hours upon hours upon hours just trying to fix, where right there, one ratchet strap took 30 seconds to pull that quarter back in. And it's also going to save us an inch, half an inch of filler in certain spots. So you can see right here, now that we got the quarter panels both aligned, the deck fillers clamped to the quarter panels, I'm going to go ahead and lift up the package tray and make sure that's tight against the inside of the deck filler panel. What I like to do, this is a little bit different, is to get my spot welder in there and save me some time. Again, I know all these panels did fit on the car and they went right here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to weld up that seam holding the deck filler panel to the quarter panels. That's the only thing I'm going to weld before the final fitment of this car. The reason is, you could see getting in there, getting around trunk gutters, hanging out underneath with this giant spot welder, it would be really challenging. So that's something, if you're very confident about your car going back together and everything's fitting good so far and your quarter panels went back in the same spot, I would say you can sit there and reach up there with a MIG welder and MIG that right now, grind it down, clean it up before you put the trunk and everything in there. It just could make life a little bit easier. We're going to go ahead now and install the trunk gutters. I like to put these on, like I said, at this part of the process before we put the tail panel in there. It just makes it easier once we get them set up. If you put them in after the tail panel, you're going to sit there and fight them. They're going to be twisting. So you'll see right now in a second when we grab the tail panel. I screw them in and I put screws kind of both ways, getting them ready to spot weld. Now those are areas that you're going to have put MIG holes down the whole thing, because the same way everywhere I'm putting this spot welder is where you're going to need to put MIG weld holes. So just remember that you're going to have to do a lot more drilling, clamping, hole punching than I'm doing right here. With the rear end, you can see I put the tail panel on the inside, and I put it against the edge of the trunk, and I roll it back and pull it. Like I said, the trunk gutters and everything, it should kind of almost wedge against there and hold into it. This one side of the car is being a little bit stubborn, so I will say there's a good chance you'll have to take a porta power, something to push it all the way back and get it lined up. And this process is usually the same, whether it's like an F-body, Camaro, Firebird, a first gen. There's the Cudas are the same way, that you just want to push these panels back. I usually do it from the inside out. It seems to work better that way, and then get it lined up. So like I said, the porta power in this situation is your friend. Also, this is a big problem with these cars. The edges on the Challengers get lazy. That's another reason. I was telling someone the other day that had a Challenger or a Nova body line sagging, that I was telling them a lot of times if you need to get the body line up in the back, these panels are just sagging down. So 2 clamps across the trunk, ratcheting them together kind of just lifts up and then fixes the tail panel profile and everything, and then the body lines, it helps bring them up. So again, once you do that, you want to put your trunk panel on the car. The reason we're doing this is we're going to put the trunk on, test fit it, and we're going to blow it all apart, because right now we're about to go into the welding phase. Everything is fit up except the roof on this car for the most part. So I need to stand back, take 15-20 minutes, as long as you need, and just stare at the car. Look down the lines. I mean, if it's your car, or if you like these model cars like me, I mean, I can look at this thing all day. So I'm just looking at it, looking for any crazy deviation or something that's wrong that we need to go back and address. And right here is something that's wrong. You can see where the trunk's flat and the edges still didn't pull up enough. So I'm taking a monkey on the stick on the jack, and you can see I'm just jacking up the whole weight of the car. Again, it helps with that heavy jig on it. And you see we just moved this up about a 1/4 inch. That's going to, again, help our back tail panel line and help our profile across the whole back of the trunk. So we'll sit there and you can see how much it lifted up. I'm hammering it back in. I did obviously relief cut it to help it take that bend, and just hammering it down. Now look at the driver's side profile and look at the passenger side, so you can see exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. So it's little things like that that really take the build to a whole nother level, and it basically comes down to you just staring at the car long enough, knowing what a 70 Challenger is supposed to look like, knowing what you want your car to look like, and then thinking about, okay, well, how do I get there? So now we're finally here to the welding phase. So this is just, nothing should move. I do have a certain way I like to weld it, and the reason I usually weld it this way, I mean, it might shift a little bit, within that area. I put a lot of screws and clamps on these things, but more than the main reason why I come up with this welding process is just so I don't miss anything. So I'll start right there, you see on the B-pillar area. I'll weld those first, and I'm going to work my way down to the whole bottom of the car and then all the way back. One quick movement, and I'm going to rotate between the spot welder and the MIG welder. That's going to save both welders, make sure we don't hit the duty cycle, because, obviously it's really hot in North Carolina, and this is pretty much consistent welding. And I only have a Lincoln Pro MIG 180, so it's not I forget what the duty cycle is. Everything that's good enough for this sheet metal, but I know I've hit the duty cycle before building frame jigs and everything else. So again, we're just saving some of the tools, let everything cool down. But this is what I'm doing with the MIG holes I was telling you earlier. If we were using a spot welder, we would just spot weld that, and we're committed to what we have. With the MIG welder, I could run 3 or 4 MIG holes down it. I could hammer, make sure everything's getting pushed in, which the spot welder would do, but then I could close the door, double check everything, just to make sure as I'm hitting the part above and working my way down, the metal's not bowing out somewhere else, or we're doing damage and nothing, stands out right now. Again, we have the car where we want it in the test fit. We spend so much time getting car dialed in. We don't want it to move now. So feel free, if you're doing this, put as many screws as you want in this thing. I mean, yeah, you got to weld them up, but it's a whole lot better to weld them up than knowing that panel's never going to move. You can see right now I'm taking all all the screws out, and that's all it is. You're just going to weld up a little screw hole. Now we're going to work our way to the bottom. Like I said, I've done the lead channel in the bottom rocker area, and I usually do weld that solid. I'll put some rosette MIG holes in it, to hold it down like the factory, and I don't want water coming in there, so I will run a bead solid through there. Again, we're not trying to save costs like the factory. I will also weld the roof channel to the quarter panel the same way. I'll do MIG holes down the whole thing, and then I'll come through the bottom and weld it, and you'll see at the walk around the end, everything will come out really smooth. It just gives us nowhere for water to go when we put whatever we're going to put in that lead channel, whether it's lead, filler, it doesn't matter, but you're protecting it from holes from the back and water attacking it from the bottom. So right now, I got my wheelhouse attachment, and we're taking the spot welder. Again, anywhere I could use a spot welder is going to save us a bunch of time. Everything's where we want it. You can see looking down this car, for a non-filler car, and I guess a rough work before any gapping or profiling or hitting on this door, this thing lines up really good with the quarter panel. Everything's going to look straight for the most part and where it needs to be for a 70 Challenger. So you can see I'm just running right through the wheelhouses. I'm coming out through the bottom trunk drop off, and I'm just coming up to the rear cross member. That's where this attachment quits reaching. Once I hit that point, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to start doing the other side. And I did the same process, the B pillar, working my way down to the front, and you can see the gap on this side is looking pretty dialed in for the most part, considering it's a new door skin and a new quarter panel. And then working my way down, same process as before, right down the wheelhouse, and we'll meet in the back of the car. Like I said, there's couple of reasons to do this. You again want to make sure not have any issues in case you are pushing metal and everything. The second thing, what you also want to do is you don't want to miss anywhere welding. You have to go through, you have to remember where you're doing. If you do it in a set system and you kind of, without even thinking, you just go to these certain parts of the car. So even if it's like a Nova, even if it's a Camaro, even if it's, it doesn't matter what the car is, this is usually a similar process I'll try to tackle. Is just kind of going around and in my head come up with that process, so I could just be in autopilot mode with the spot welder. So you can see I changed my attachment now, and I'm working the tail panel from the center. I'm working out one way. I'm going to work up the side of the tail panel all the way to the trunk gutters. Then I'm going to work the other way out the side up to tail gutters. Once I do that, I'm going to climb in the trunk and I'm going to weld that area. I will say there's a lot of times right now before I do the tail panel, I think on Novas especially, I'll start now up top at the roof, the top of the B pillar, and I'll work my way down and then do the tail panel on the Novas and stuff last. Again, I wouldn't say there's any complete this way has to be done. We can modify the process. To me right now, with the attachments I had and the rotation, this just makes it easier. And why I'm welding the tail panel in first, I'm going to be climbing in and out of this trunk. I just want to make sure nothing moves. Like it's just clamped on there. There's a couple screws in the top. It shouldn't move. But again, this is our reassurance and our policy, our safe policy. If we go ahead and just weld it now, we know it's not going anywhere. I will also say, you heard me say how great the frame jigs are for bending, twisting the car, and just prying against, and you've seen it in the video. Another reason is, look how high it puts the car. For a taller person with this spot welder, working, a foot off the ground, this would be miserable on the back and bending up, where I could sit there, almost stand up, and it makes holding these tools and everything a lot easier. And they're not that heavy, but when you hold this for hours upon hours every day, it starts to really stink over time. So that's just another reason why I think even if at your home, building the frame jig, it might save you more hassle down the road, or buying something that you can modify into a frame table, frame jig, get the car up higher if it's possible. So like I said, I did go ahead before I jumped in the trunk. I welded the deck filler panel, MIG welded, to the package tray, both the inside and the back side where my screw holes are. Once that was welded in solid, I also welded the trunk hinges on there, and I'm coming back through now with the spot welder, and I'm going to just finish everything off. We're going to run our spot welders down both our trunk gutters now that we know everything's there. And you see now we're going to weld our trunk gutters, are our key piece in stiffening up the deck filler to the quarter panels to the tail panel. So we're going to finish that off, and the back of this car is pretty much completely welded up. So same thing on the other side. You see a couple spots here or there. We're going to match kind of what the factory did, probably add a little bit more, but really now the whole back of the car is done. I'll come back through once I'm done with all these spot welders. We'll pull out the screws and just tack them through with the MIG welder. Like I said, again, we're rotating. Now that all the process on the bottom of the car is done, we're going to go ahead and tackle the roof. I'm put on the roof. I traced out where this center bow brace is because on a Challenger it's got to be glued. We're going to be using a 3M 08115 panel bonding adhesive for this process. You can see it right here. I'm going to put a little bit coat on there. Now it adheres to bare metal only. It says do not use on epoxies, everything else. Again, if you read the TDS, that's why it was crucial to grind out those areas. On the roof area, what I end up doing too is I'll actually spread with my finger over all the areas that we just ground down, knowing we're not going to have rust on there. I take a ratchet strap right over that bow, and I'm not cranking on it, but you can see right now I just hooked in there, and that's going to help hold the roof all the way down across that whole roof bow. What we're going to do, and you can see it's getting later in the day, so this is a job that I'll do at night. I usually glue the roof, then I'll come back the next day or so, and then we'll go ahead and tackle the welding on that process. So once it's strapped in there, I'm taking all my clamps, and we're going to then clamp this thing front to rear. Megan's helping me obviously with it. A roof is one of those jobs that just you really need two people. And then once we're done with the clamps, we're going to go ahead and stick these two paint roller sticks, and you see they're kind of pushed up. We're not jamming them up there, but we don't want the center of the brace bowing down. We want it actually to hold structure on the roof. So we're lightly going to push them up, let the glue set overnight, and the next day we come back and we're in the welding process. Same thing, we're going to use a spot welder because the spot welder gets right there in all the drip rails, so that's why I didn't drill out all these holes. If you had to drill holes on the roof and stuff, I mean, you know, it's not the end of the world, but this makes it a whole lot easier. I did come through to the back in a couple areas and just kind of just go back with the MIG welder and run a bead on it, just on a couple areas that the spot welder was half on and half off of the drip rails. It's just the edge of these Challengers. Sometimes they don't overhang enough like you would see on a factory car. Again, not the end of the world, just we adjust accordingly. We're going to put some self-leveling seam sealer, or that's what you probably should be using in this area, self-leveling seam sealer to cover whatever you're doing here anyway. So, and then that's going to just make this area look pretty clean. And you can use regular seam sealer. Just in an area like this, I think the self-leveling looks better in the long run. So it's the same thing on this side. Again, we just run through with the spot welds. I'm going to go ahead and MIG the A-pillar channels, and then there's a couple areas around the spot welder at the very end. I'm also going to MIG weld because it's 3 layers of pieces. So again, I don't trust the MIG welder on that, or the spot welder on getting a bunch of metals on top of each other, so we'll go ahead and just MIG those areas. Again, combination of spot welder, MIG weld, MIG welder, whatever is the most efficient and does the best job. You can see right here I'm adjusting the power on the spot welder on some areas that there's another piece of metal underneath, and we're just again running the top of the roof on the front and rear, and then this is going to finish off this job. We're going to go ahead and just bolt on the trunk, and then after that kind of just double check all our stuff, and we'll come back for some final thoughts, and you can see this car now that it's all one complete unit.
All right, we're going to wrap up the rear sheet metal install on the 70 Challenger, and looking at it, like I said in the beginning of the video, it's starting to really come together and the car is finally complete. We still have a little bit of dialing in on things to do. I have to talk with the owner exactly where he wants to take this car and how much we want to adjust some of these gaps and fine tune them. You know, everyone has their own differences on personal opinion on what they like on gaps or not, and I build it to the owners their preferences. So what we did, you saw we put the quarter panels, we put the trunk, the deck filler, the tail panel, the roof on, and everything's complete. I did, looking around the car, the door gaps are pretty close. There's gonna be some inconsistencies on some of the stampings with the aftermarket panels. You saw how we fixed some of them in the back by just hiking them up and pulling in the quarters. You could see the trunk gap on one side, on the driver's side, just needs to be closed up a little bit. No matter how much we pull rolled it up, the tab behind it was just binding against it. And if I went further or cut everything, then what it's going to do is go off center the rear. So this is just stuff you need to expect to just fine tune, and that's why we're going to go through the gapping phase. You can see I did cut the car off the frame jig in the back, so now we really only have a couple supports in the center. Most of them are pin locations for the frame rail, and I'm going to leave those on there. We'll just lift it off when it's all said and done. But looking around, the profile on the car, both sides, looks really good. You can look down it. You got to remember, there's no filler on this car. It's all sheet metal. So in general, that's what we were after. We were after dialing in the fender gap or the fender profile to the quarter profile, the trunk back here. Everything's lined up looking really good. You can see I still do not have the door latches in the car. We're just holding them on with clips. So that's what makes it, I like to adjust them initially. So when we line everything up, the latch isn't binding it, lifting the door up or down. This is where the door wants to sit, and it's not, you know, it's not tweaked or anything else like that, and we're just pulling a Band-Aid. I will say, I always hear people say, adjust the door with weight lifted up beforehand. Realistically, you put weight in the doors on really the final fitment, because think about it, if the door's up a little bit higher, when you put the weight in, it settles down. What we're looking at right here is we're adjusting the car just on sheet metal to sheet metal panel. We don't care about how much weight is in the door, because when it sags, it's going to still sit square to square here when you're done. So yes, I agree, you want to weight the doors and lift them up when you're doing your final, you know, you trimmed out your car and this is the final time it's going, because you don't want to come in here and nick the paint and try to adjust the hinge. But right now in the metal phase, there's no need for that. We test fit everything. All we care about is our gaps and everything. You can't gap a car if the door is sitting a 1/4 inch higher. Figuring it's, so that's the idea behind gapping. So yes, people that say that are correct on it, but in the metal stage, this is not the time to do that. Next video, like I said, we will get our door latches in there. Well, they're in getting cleaned up in some lacquer thinner and the parts washer right now, getting the grease and stuff out of them. Right now, that's going to do work out for us. Also on the doors, you see I did go down both sides and I spot welded them with the spot welder on both sides, just again to clean it up and make everything look a little bit more factory and give it, you know, make it a little bit stronger. With the trunk, same thing. You can see back here, we did install the valance on the bottom. We got it tucked in pretty well on both sides. We pulled that in a little bit, and like I said, we got our brackets in there. The trunk latch, I was gonna install the rear trunk latch bracket, but I realized we don't have one. So one's on order, that will be installed maybe on the next video. I might do it off camera. I've done them before in other videos, but just for now, we got the trunk. And like I said, I have it adjusted where everything's worked pretty good on the trunk. The hinges open and close. With those, before we weld them in, I just want to recap. We move the hinges before we weld them left and right. So when we close the trunk, we're pretty much centered right where we want to go. Again, we don't want the latch yanking the trunk left or right and it binding. It doesn't make things easier. So in general, everything fits good on the 70 Challenger. I'm really happy with it. The car is really looking together. On the next video, like I said, I'm going to talk to the owner first. We're going to start gapping the car, get it stripped down to bare metal. We might try to get it outside a little bit, maybe take a walk around video. We'll do that when it's done. But really the car in general looks really good. If you like this kind of content, I mean, please subscribe to our channel. Please like the video and feel free to comment. I'm always open for feedback, ways on improving things. Like I said, we're changing our process all the time to try to make things more efficient and build these cars better. So we possibly have another build coming on the channel. This one's not done yet. It's going to go at least into the gapping phase and probably the bodywork phase. We're still working out the issues with that. So stay tuned for that. If you like these cars, we're going to try to put other models on there. I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. Thanks again for sticking along, and I hope you enjoyed so far this brand new, 1970 Challenger build that we're doing. We'll see you on the next video.